Two U.S. Air Force trainers have been sentenced in connection with a widening sexual abuse scandal at one of the busiest military training centers in the nation. Why has the Pentagon failed to curb widespread sexual misconduct and abuse in the armed forces? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Investigators say at least 38 female trainees were victimized at the Lackland Air Force Base in the U.S. state of Texas. 15 instructors have been implicated. Last year, nearly 3,200 rapes and sexual assaults were officially reported. But the Pentagon admits that represents just 15% of all incidents. A military survey revealed that 1 in 5 women in the U.S. forces has been sexually assaulted. But most do not report it. Nearly half say that they, quote, did not want to cause trouble in their unit. A former Army nurse told a member of the U.S. Congress that during her tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, she was more afraid of being attacked by her fellow soldiers than she was of the enemy. Many of those attacked are men. In 2010, nearly 50,000 male veterans screened positive for, quote, military sexual trauma, end quote, at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. In April, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced new steps to deter assaults and make it easier to prosecute offenders. But some argue a military culture that makes it difficult for crimes to be reported is standing in the way of meaningful change. I spoke to Paula Coughlin-Puopolo, a former lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. In 1991, she was groped by at least 200 men at a convention of Navy and Marine Corps aviators. She went public, and what was known as the tailhook scandal ensued. But no one was punished. I asked her what's changed since the early 1990s.
I would venture to say that the situation in the military regarding sexual harassment and sexual assault has changed for the worse. And unfortunately, I think the statistics and the criminal activity that is finally actually being recorded will support that.
The Pentagon says the spike in the number of sexual assaults being reported is a sign of progress because people are coming forward now.
I'm sure that's partially true, but what I also feel the other part of the story that's now coming forward is that what we have uncovered is a problem of serial rapists and serial sexual assaults, and those numbers seem to support that we've got a problem where sexual assaults victims are coming forward, but their complaints aren't actually being handled. So kind of the situation in parallel to the Catholic Church, where we've got a perpetrator of a crime who gets possibly a slap on the wrist and moved to another command, or even reinstated into the command where they have already been accused of a crime, and no one is actually convicted. So if you want to look at those statistics and say that we've got a wonderful program going where people are coming forward with the crimes that have been perpetrated against them, that's a good start. But what they actually do with those complaints is really the other half of the story that is even more important to eliminating the initial and ongoing assaults.
In your case, it seemed pretty clear that the first impulse of those in charge wasn't to punish the perpetrators, but to cover the incident up and blame the victim. Do you feel that impulse has changed at all?
No, actually, I think that that's possibly one of the most consistent situations that we have with every victim, is that ultimately, when I came forward with my complaint, I was, oh my gosh, the abuse that I took and the personal attacks And even within the chain of command, when I told my boss what happened to me, he said, "That's what you get." And the attitude hasn't changed much. And the actions of most of the military leadership now towards a person who comes forward as a victim is to remove them from their job and ultimately punish them. Well, the perpetrator, in my case, all of the perpetrators continued to march on smartly with a successful career. My boss, who told me that's what you get, was promoted to a 2-star admiral and retired with full benefits. And I think that across the board, most of the time, you're going to find that the victim ultimately is the one who suffers and the perpetrator continues to march on smartly.
Yeah, I mean, are you satisfied then with the expressions of concern being expressed by the leadership of the military and by Congress?
If the chain of command really wants to fix this situation, as evidenced by a closed-door hearing yesterday with the House Armed Services Committee, they would open the doors and they would actually be paying attention to all of the very consistent complaints that these sexual assault victims have. And not just in the environment where they worked, but how they were mistreated when they brought their complaints forward. And case in point, if they were listening in the last 20 years, since Tailhook, the sexual assault scandal involving me, if they really had instituted changes that had come from learning from my experience, I think that they would have had tremendous gains in professionalism and most of all the safety of the people that are working in the armed services. But the committee yesterday, and I'm referring to the closed-door hearing with the Air Force over the Lackland scandal, you know, they were in the committee room, they had the door closed, and yet they had a tremendous, powerful resource right outside their doors. And for a variety of reasons, they have chosen not to listen to us, and but I think they're interested in solving it. I don't think that they really are interested in listening. And maybe it's a squeamish conversation that real leadership doesn't want to hear about the rape and the victimization of their troops. But you can't solve this problem until you turn the lights on it.
So what can be done to tackle widespread sexual abuse in the military? With me in the studio is Morris Davis. He's a retired U.S. Air Force colonel who led the investigation into a sexual abuse scandal at the U.S. Air Force Academy in 2003. Also here in the studio, Ariana Clay, a former U.S. Marine officer. She's one of 8 current and former military members who filed a lawsuit alleging they were raped, assaulted or harassed during their service. And in San Francisco, Aaron Belkin. He's a professor of political science at San Francisco State University and the author of Bring Me Men, Military Masculinity and the Benign Facade of American Empire. Ariana Clay, first of all then, we were just hearing from Lieutenant Coughlin-Puopolo there. Did you have a similar experience as you were trying to seek redress?
I did. I think that after the crimes are reported, well, first of all, I think underreporting is still an issue. And second, after the crime is reported, the reprisal is often the worst experience of the victim. And the conviction of the perpetrators is a serious issue. In 2012, the SAPRO report, SAPRO is the organization charged with protecting the victims and training the military on sexual assault and harassment. In their 200-plus page report, they reported that a 2% conviction rate. If you look down in the footnote of the conviction rate, that conviction rate includes lesser offenses. So if a perpetrator is convicted of, say, conduct unbecoming of an officer, that would count as a conviction for sexual assault in their report. And I think it's important to present this kind of misleading data to just raise awareness on the seriousness of the issue and the lack of prosecution.
Colonel Davis, though, I mean, you were an investigator, a successful investigator. You led a successful investigation in 2003. How difficult, though, was it, or how easy was it to do your job?
Doing the job wasn't that difficult. It was frustrating, because if you look back, like Lieutenant Coughlin, that was 1991, so 2 decades ago. And we had, every time these incidents happen, we have an investigation, we do a survey, Congress has a hearing, and then 4 or 5 years later there's another incident. So we went from Tailhook in 91 to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in 96, Air Force Academy in 2003, Lackland in 2012, and the problem just continues. When I joined the military in 1983, we still had some officers' clubs that had strippers on Friday night. Or you go down to the squadrons, there'd be centerfolds hanging up. And it really was sort of a boys' club. And I think that boys' club mentality is not as overt as it was 30 years ago when I joined, but there's still that mentality that boys will be boys, and this only becomes a crisis when it gets out in public.
We'll get into the culture of the military in a moment, but even when then cases are addressed, though, as Lieutenant Puopolo was saying, I mean, it seems to be the, Lieutenant Coughlin-Puopolo was saying, it's the victim who tends to be to lose, she said, and actually often the perpetrators quietly move to another unit, and then she raised this issue of then having serial sex offenders moving from unit to unit. How is this allowed to happen?
The typical military reaction to any crisis, whether like the Haditha massacre or sexual assault, is, does anyone know about it? And if no one does, then we don't have a problem. Or can we cover it up so that it doesn't get out? And then when it does get out, then it's addressed. But I think the initial reaction is, can we keep this quiet? And that often means covering it up, moving the perpetrator. One of the problems at the Air Force Academy, what really kind of burst the bubble there, were cadets' similar reaction, feeling that they were victimized again by the process. When they came forward and reported sexual assaults, I mean, often alcohol is involved in a lot of these incidents. And suddenly they're being punished for having consumed alcohol in a training environment. So this whole process of victims feeling like they're victimized again by the system discourages reporting, and I think keeps a lot of this under wraps.
But just to help us understand, even when found guilty of some terrible crime, they're still not prosecuted as such. Could you help us understand how that works?
Yeah, actually at Lackland, I'm very pleased to see Sergeant Walker got a 20-year sentence, which in my estimation is a pretty significant sentence for this type of conduct. In the past, we had a Judge Advocate General of the Air Force who was having inappropriate relations with more than a dozen women, officers, enlisted, married, single. He retired as a colonel. Now he did, instead of retiring as a two-star, retired as a colonel, but I'm a retired colonel and I don't find that to be a lot of punishment. But he was never prosecuted for his conduct.
And one thing to add is, even when they do have these hardline prosecutions, in this case 20 years confinement, I think oftentimes when it does become a matter of public attention, they will scapegoat a couple people, like there are a couple of bad apples, when the real issue is the closed system of leadership that condones, retaliates, and covers up instances of sexual assault and harassment.
Professor Belkin, then, I mean, so there's a secondary problem of what happens after this sort of abuse comes to light. But actually, as far as the underreporting is concerned, what seems particularly disturbing is to consider how many people must have been abused or assaulted over the decades in the military. Is there any attempt underway to try and find out how big that number is?
Well, the Pentagon has actually done a good job of producing statistics, especially in the last year, about underreporting. And if you look at the studies of the service academies, they ask victims whether they reported the assaults or not, and if not, why. So we have more and more data on that all the time. But I think there's actually a broader point to make, which is, at least as I see it, this is not just a culture, a problem about a culture of underreporting and a system that punishes victims for reporting, but this is really a rape culture in the military. In other words, even if victims were more able to report the crimes, there's to my mind, even bigger question of what's producing the rapes in the first place, and that's something that as a society we haven't addressed.
All right, so what is producing the rapes in the first place?
Well, to my mind, you have a rape culture, and you have an organization that's very masculinist, of course, and that places a lot of value on dominance and power and subordination. And you also have a system that's trying to train people to overcome inhibitions against violence. So of course, to produce a warrior, we have to train people how to become violent. And then the third piece, I would say, is that in the training scenario, you create a kind of a master-slave dynamic where commanders have almost unlimited authority over people that they're in charge of. And when you put those three factors together, you have a recipe for rape.
Ariana Claire?
I think with, he says, the unlimited power is an important point. And I do think the rape culture in the military does reflect larger society. There's just going to be some people that are predators, but there are also the group in between that may or may not. And right now, because of that unchecked power, leaving prosecution within the chain of command, I feel is the issue. I think they need to take, Secretary Panetta proposed moving it up the chain of command. So the colonel is the authority that decides whether it proceeds. But I think they need to completely remove it from the chain of command. That colonel often has more to lose in his career by reporting assaults on his watch.
But Colonel Davis, doesn't the military rely on that chain of command? How can they dilute that with outside bodies becoming involved? Where will it end? I'm sure they'd ask then. I mean,
that is a difficulty, because military justice is a unique process where commanders are responsible for the good order and discipline of their unit. So taking a piece of that away from them and saying, we don't trust you to handle it, we want someone else to, would really be a sea change in the way military justice is traditionally.
Is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, some might say actually it might not be bad to have bodies to where people can go and complain about potential human rights abuses or the international law being broken in combat or something else. I mean, this would open the doors to all sorts of units, and I suppose then, wouldn't it? It would.
It would be a significant departure from 200 plus years of the way that military justice has worked, which is not to say that it shouldn't be looked at and considered, and it might be a viable.
In the U.S., some European countries have implemented, independent judiciary systems in their military that have been effective. Right. And I think sometimes we're doing a disservice to these commanders by forcing them to report whether or not there was an assault on their watch. Leave it to someone else, and they don't have to worry about that mark on their career. It's not there. It's no longer something they're obligated to report.
But again, what about the point that people are being trained, though, with the concept of unit cohesion above all else? There's this omerta, there's this code of silence. And surely that is part of the training. How then do you get that nuanced approach where you say, look, you do not betray your unit but you can, though, in sometimes, and in that case, then you go to some outside power, indeed, and you talk to them about this.
Right.
Well, I think you almost need to.
On that?
Yeah, Professor.
I don't necessarily disagree with any of the reforms that Ariana Clay is calling for, and it's important, of course, to have smart and thoughtful people working on these changes, but at the same time, I do think it's important to step back and remember, at the Air Force Academy, when they had the 2003 rape scandal, the Academy was seen as having state-of-the-art prevention and reporting programming among all the service academies at the time. And so whenever a rape scandal happens, or whenever a rape scandal is reported, there's really a rape scandal every day in the military, but whenever these get reported, we get people in Congress and activists talking about this reform and that reform, take it out of command, put it in command, get a hotline, whatever. These are important reforms, but I don't know if there are any reforms that are going to solve the problem as long as you have a military culture that produces rape.
Professor Davis, and that's the problem. In order to train someone into becoming a warrior, they are inculcated with a spirit of superiority, of power relations that make this sort of behavior inevitable.
That's true. I mean, the military is a culture where you're taught to obey orders and not question them. And people that speak up are viewed as malcontents.
But this isn't just about complaining. This is about actually committing the rape in the first place.
Yeah, I think we've got to change the culture from the bottom up and the top down. I think we need leaders that don't just mouth the words, that they take this seriously and they show they're serious about it. But we also need, from the bottom up, this notion of loyalty that is inbred.
And again, you're talking about what happens after the rape. We're talking about how these rapes actually occur.
I'm talking about to prevent it, though, because I think we need to. This needs to be looked at like the Jerry Sandusky incident at Penn State, where we're a team, and if you're loyal, your loyalty's got to be to the team, not to your buddy. So, like at Lackland, where you've got 15 instructors that just kind of chuckled and went about it and encouraged this. Your loyalty's got to be to the institution, to the Constitution, to the country, and not to your buddy when he's committing a crime. And the women that are being abused, they're our teammates, and you don't abuse your teammates. We've got to change that culture that allows people.
Professor Belkin, is there that room for maneuver? You've done a lot of studying of how people are trained. Is there that wiggle room there is it all or nothing? How does it work?
Well, I don't know if there's that wiggle room, and part of my critique is that the problem might be more with the public than with the military, but it's not, I would say, as Ariana was suggesting, that rapes in the military are just a reflection of broader society. I think the problem starts with the public's uncritical glorification of warriors. And it's so difficult to have these conversations in public. I'm sure after the show I'm going to get hate mail. People who read my book send hate email. It's really the public's unwillingness to look at what's going on in the military that I would argue is the beginning of the problem. So I would say we need to reform the public as we reform the military.
Is this unique to the military, though? What about other hierarchical, authoritarian type units? The police force, for example. Do we see similar sorts of abuses going on?
Much bigger problem in the military. And you look across a range of types of desperate behavior, shaken baby syndrome, binge drinking, riding a motorcycle without a helmet, unprotected sex, rape, all kinds of behaviors that are a function of desperation in the desperate environment are much more prevalent in the military than outside.
Aaron and Clay, do you see any real stomach to take on some of these issues, which seem to be so fundamental to how the US runs its military and has done so for decades?
I think there is. I mean, we have the most technologically advanced military in the world, and it could be better. I think that, his point is valid. The military they're human beings too. And I think by not having Congress hold them accountable, just as we would any other human being in this all-volunteer force, is doing our military incredible disservice. Yes, there are going to be some of these.
But again, Congress is too scared to speak out because they know what will happen.
I do think that they're too afraid of the military-industrial complex, too afraid to challenge it, and I think that's
public opinion, there is, Professor.
I agree. Public opinion is part of that as well. The military, the U.S. public has more confidence in the military organization than any other organization in the U.S.
Colonel Davis, so give us some hope then.
Well, I think there is hope. I mean, again, every time this comes up, I think we're all hopeful that this will be the last time we have a mass incident. You'll never reduce the number to zero, but we should be able to eliminate these mass problems like at Lackland, where you have groups of people, or Aberdeen, where there are groups of people, or Tailhook. But I think you do that by a leadership that's serious about it and shows that they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. By changing the culture, that your loyalty is to the team and the total team, you don't prey on your teammates. By having
again, Professor Belkin says, I mean, that's just simply anathema to the entire manner in which the U.S. military, the philosophy of the U.S. military, and how they're building these teams and these units.
Well, we've been adaptable.
And how they train people to kill, frankly.
Well, we went through radical change. We integrated minorities, we've integrated women, we've repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The military follows orders, and I think if they believe that this is serious and people are held accountable, that we can change that culture. But we also have to have an avenue for victims to be able to come forward in confidence and get help and counseling and advice on how they should proceed. And particularly in the training environment, we really are in kind of that guard-inmate type relationship. There's really not a good avenue for them to get advice and assistance.
We do have these new rules then that were announced this year. Victims can now seek an immediate transfer if the person accused is in the same unit. Evidence from rape cases will be kept for 50 years so that victims have more time to file charges. Local unit commanders must report allegations to a special court-martial convening authority, and no one below the rank of colonel or Navy captain can dismiss assault allegations. On the face of it, is that a way forward?
I think there are some steps in the right direction. I think that part of the retaliation is that you often work for the potential perpetrator and his friends. And I think being able to have the confidence that you can move to another command after reporting is a step forward. But I think rape kits are lost all the time in these cases. So saying that they'll be kept for 50 years, when right now we're not even seeing them come to the courts, I have difficulty believing. And also putting that weight on the colonel or the 06 level authority, as I said earlier, that circle just becomes smaller and smaller as you get higher up in the chain of the command, and they often have more to lose. I think that's just treating the symptoms, not the disease, which is command influence.
Professor Belkin, just deck chairs on the Titanic there in the end, from what you say?
Yeah. I wish I had more hope, and again, I don't want to yank the rug out from under the activists. And I actually believe that Secretary Panetta, certainly President Obama, the military's top brass, the commander-in-chief, everybody wants to solve this problem. I don't think this is a problem of insincere intentions. I think it's a problem of a culture that's so deeply entrenched that reforms on the margin really aren't going to be sufficient.
Because the consequences of change are just too far-reaching. I mean, even the concept of change is too far-reaching.
Yeah, I mean, what are we going to do? Stop training warriors? I mean, the way we train warriors is conducive to a rape culture.
We only have 30 seconds left. Aaron and Clay, what advice would you give those who are serving, who are experiencing the sort of trauma that you did?
I would say that they should do a restricted report and request to leave their current command so they can be safer. But I think any other measures, they need to remove command influence from the judiciary system.
Ariana Clay, thank you very much. Professor Morris Davis, Colonel Morris Davis as well, thank you very much. Professor Aaron Belkin, thank you too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering.